Welcome to the Journey Home. My name is Marcus Grodi, your host for this weekly live program, in which I have the wonderful privilege of introducing to you men and women who, because of their great love for Jesus Christ, followed him faithfully in the church, some with complete surprise becoming Catholic. My guest this morning is David Alton. We're taping this program because in a week or two I'll be in England. We'll be filming a series of Journey Home programs with English converts. My wife Marilyn and I will both be over there with great excitement going to England. And we had the privilege now of having Lord David Alton here at EWTN filming a series. So it was a great coup to be able to have this opportunity to film this program with Lord David Alton, and we'll introduce him in just a moment. As he and I were discussing what would be an appropriate theme for this program, David is a lifelong Catholic, but we thought, well, what would be an appropriate theme for the Journey Home program? The idea of the 3 C's came up. The 3 C's of conversion, conscience, and compromise. The issue of conversion, we're all called to be converts. We'll talk about that. And the struggle of conscience. We're looking at England. The struggle of conscience and living your faith in the country of England with the struggles of the faith of Anglicanism, Catholicism, and the other faiths that have actually surprisingly gained such a strong hold in England. And then third, the issue of compromise. Lord David Alton is a politician, a Catholic politician in that struggle of living the faith, but at the same time being an influence of change for truth. We're going to talk about that in a moment. So David, welcome to the Journey Home.
Thank you, Marcus. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I don't know very much about English politics, so I've got to be careful I don't put my foot in my mouth more than I usually do on the Journey Home program. But so you be sure to correct me if I'm as an ignorant American misrepresenting English politics.
Well, they say, don't they, that the English and the Americans are divided by a common language, and often we use the same words to mean entirely different things. So you'll put me right as well, I hope, if I get things wrong as we go.
18 years in the Lord of Commons?
House of Commons for 18 years, yes. I was elected there as the youngest member of the House of Commons, but before that I served for 8 years in local government in the city of Liverpool, which some people call the gateway to America. And I was first elected there as a student. And then I stood down in 1997 after I left the party I'd been a member of over the abortion issue. They made it a matter of party policy, and I said I couldn't live with that. And I took up a chair as a professor in one of the universities in Liverpool. But simultaneously I was offered a seat in the House of Lords. And it's a curious way we do things in England, but we have 2 houses rather like you do. Our upper house is not elected like the Senate is, but it's appointed. You're appointed for the remainder of your life. And so for bad behavior I've been sent to the penitentiary for the rest of my life.
I was thinking, though, as we were talking earlier about that, that the beauty of being assigned for life to this is you're able to have an influence without feeling like you're going to get kicked out if you say the wrong thing. Even in America, a football coach can't last a season if he says the wrong thing or does the wrong things. So you have that power.
Well, that is true, absolutely true. Having spent so many years in elected politics and a member of a party, I'm certainly aware of the third word that we're going to be talking about later on, the issue of compromise. Yeah. And sometimes compromise can be the death of principles. I look at politicians and I'm not less interested in whether they're left or right than in whether they're right or wrong. I'm more interested in what their causes are than their partisanship. If they don't have causes, I wonder why they're there, and often it's only usually to pursue their own personal agenda or to promote their own power or ego or whatever it is. But I think causes are the thing that mark out people in politics, and we should have causes that we want to pursue, and certainly that's the reason why I hope I've stayed in politics over the years.
And that's that struggle of being an independent versus party, because if you're going to push a cause, you need lots of votes. Yes, and as an independent, there's your struggle with pushing a cause.
It is. It's a big struggle because in order to make an effect on politics, you do have to rouse the conscience of the nation. You do have to get people to stand up and be counted, and that does mean getting them to cast their votes. But my belief is that they should cast their votes less on partisan lines and more on the basis of what individual politicians stand for. So they need to look very closely at the issues that a politician embraces and say, is that really what I believe, before just blindly following some party allegiance. W.S. Gilbert, a great writer of music, of lyrics in the 19th century for the great Gilbert and Sullivan operettas, said they always vote at their party's call and never think for themselves at all. So I think what we need to be is thinking people who work it out for ourselves. I often think that we're like the old saying that they have about that what is needed for the pearl to come out of the oyster is a bit of grit to enter in, and that we need to be more like bits of grit entering in order to produce the pearl. So these days I sit as an independent on the crossbenches. I'm no longer a member of a political party. But Winston Churchill once said a man shouldn't be without a party for too long. And I just mourn, really, that there isn't a party I personally feel I can join. I do believe that if you can gather together with others with a like mind and then pursue a common agenda, common themes, pursue your causes, because you build a coalition around you about those particular themes and issues, then you've got a better chance of succeeding on them. So an individual can only do so much.
But you in your election to that position, carried on a tradition with a man that many of the audience might be familiar with, Hilaire Belloc.
Well, Hilaire Belloc was the last Catholic to sit as a Liberal Member of Parliament. Now, the word liberal is one of those words that we misunderstand on both sides of the Atlantic. In continental Europe, being liberal meant being anti-clerical. In America, being liberal means being on the left on a whole series of issues. In England, being a big L liberal meant that you were part of the Gladstonian traditions. And remember, both G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc were members of the Gladstonian Liberal Party. Curiously, they ended up leaving it partly because of another Liberal in that time, Winston Churchill, who later on, of course, became a Conservative. He started as a Conservative, became a Liberal, and then went back to the Conservative Party. But Churchill, whilst he was Liberal Home Secretary, introduced a bill to forcibly sterilise people who were mentally or physically defective. And that piece of legislation in 1913 was one of the things that led Chesterton and Belloc to renounce their liberal allegiances. And Chesterton, of course, went on to write his book, Eugenics and Other Evils, and he and an independent MP called Josiah Wedgwood fought Churchill's proposed legislation, and it was withdrawn. And I think from Churchill's point of view, it's just as well that it was, because we wouldn't perhaps recall him now as a great statesman, but he subsequently became.
I didn't know. 1913.
1913, that legislation came before Parliament, just before the beginning of the First World War.
The issue that many of the Journey Home audience may be familiar with, that has come up many times in talking about conversion, is that one of the watersheds in the pro-life issue is that in the Lambeth Conference of 1930, we have that decision to kind of open the crack in the door to the issues of contraception, which was the first, and then it led to everything. It's interesting that 1913 preceded that.
It did, Marcus, and even more interestingly, there was a select committee that met in Parliament to look at that bill, and both primates of the Church of England, both the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York, were on that committee, and both of them endorsed and supported that legislation. And the then Bishop of Birmingham, Bishop Barnes, wrote in a publication called the Eugenics Review why Christians should support the idea of the selecting out of people who were mentally or physically defective. So this idea of eugenics was given a baptism by the established church at that time.
I'm going to make sure we make for our audience that I don't want to cause problems here, but when you say Archbishop and Bishop, you mean of the Church of England?
I do. These were the two primates of the Church of England, the Archbishops of Canterbury and York. And of course, by Birmingham, I don't mean Birmingham, Alabama. I mean Birmingham, England.
We say it different here anyway. Let's, this is all fascinating. And before we jump into our talk, because boy, this is very interesting. But I wanted to also give you a bit of a plug while you're here about the program that you're filming.
Well, I'm making a series of 13 programs called The Suffering Church. And the idea for this series came out of an organization that I founded with 3 other people who were evangelical Protestant Christians. And the 4 of us met together in a room called the Jubilee room in the House of Commons. And we'd taken up together the case of 7 Siberian Christians. They were Pentecostals. You may remember the case. They were holed up in the American embassy in Moscow, and they could neither go out nor could they come in. They weren't being allowed to leave the country, and if they left the embassy, then they would have been arrested and sent back to Siberia. eventually, as a result of a lot of campaigning around the world, they were freed. But I was then inundated with letters about other similar cases. And so I met together with some friends from across the denominational divide and said, what can we do about this? And a man called Danny Smith had set up a group called Jubilee, and we decided to found it in Parliament and make it the Jubilee campaign in Parliament. Why? Because, of course, the word Jubilee comes from the book of Isaiah. A time, he said, when fields would be left fallow to regain their goodness. A time when unfair burdens of debt would be removed from those who were ground down by them. And a time when prisoners who were unfairly held would be set free. And this seemed a good theme for us. And Jesus himself, of course, in the very first public declaration he made in the synagogue in Nazareth, said, I have come to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour, to be the year of Jubilee. And what Jesus was calling on us to be was to change personally, deep personal conversion of heart to learn to love him as our Saviour, but also to change the world around us. Jesus says that we must be salt and light in the world around us. So that's a call for us to engage in the world around us, not to retreat into a narrow form of pietism. And I think that the suffering Christians in many parts of the world have taught us really how much we take those basic things for granted. We take our religious liberties for granted. But I think we have to use those liberties and privileges, our talents, if you like. The idea of the parable of the talents is one that always appeals to me. There's nothing wrong with privilege or having talents, so long as you use them for the help of others. So we founded together this Jubilee campaign to campaign for Christians who were unfairly held in various parts of the world, mainly the former communist countries, the Soviet Union and the satellites around it. And in order to give it greater strength, in Washington, D.C., Jubilee America was founded as well. So it's a twin sister organisation based both in Washington and in London. We also now have satellites elsewhere in Europe and other parts of the world. And since 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, its focus has moved onto the Islamic world and onto the Far East. So 13 programmes are being made here at EWTN this week, and they're looking at different countries, as different as North Korea and Egypt, as different as Saudi Arabia and Laos. We're looking at a whole range of issues affecting Christians from different denominations and at their suffering, and telling people what they can do about it.
There's a unique irony, though, in the fact that you as an English Catholic have started this program, are also doing these series, given the history of Catholicism in England and the same struggles.
Well, Marcus, perhaps it's not an irony, perhaps it's logical in some ways, because I think coming from Our Lady's Dowry, coming from England, a country so steeped in Catholicism, it breaks my heart when I see the destruction of the Church, the body of Christ in our country. The reason why I think that secularization and paganism has been able to spread so rapidly in England is because when a house is divided, it cannot stand. St. Paul says, doesn't he, that when the trumpet gives off an uncertain sound, then the world will become confused, and we are a very confused world today, and I think it's because we broke the body of Christ. Thomas More talked about the unity of life, and the disunity of life is, I think, one of the reasons why it's so difficult to witness in the world today. And I'm very conscious of the sacrifice that people made 400 years ago in giving their lives for their beliefs. I went to a school that was named for Edmund Campion. Every day of my life when I'm at Westminster, I walk through the hall, the great hall at Westminster where Edmund Campion stood trial and was taken away from there to be executed. He was hung, drawn and then quartered, body cut into pieces at Tyburn. Which today is Marble Arch, right in the heart of London. Yes, I mean, this happened to him, as you say, while he was still alive. And I think about his story and the effect it had on those who even saw him at that time. And I think about the story of Thomas More, who also stood trial in that great hall. And I know that the sacrifice they made is one that we must treasure in our times and that we must pass on to the next generation. It's not about triumphalism, because after all, this was a time when Catholics also persecuted, and His Holiness Pope John Paul II reminds us of how we have to be sensitive and conscious of the persecution that was meted out on both sides. But we shouldn't forget that part of our narrative. I mean, that's the point. We mustn't forget it. The importance of standing firm for your beliefs and then finding ways of travelling along the road together. And in a curious way, I think the persecution of Christians, Protestant, Orthodox and Catholic around the world is for me a great source of unity here is a point where we can stand together in the household of faith and witness of our love for Jesus and witness to their heroism and their bravery and courage as a source of inspiration. I'll never forget, Marcus, going to the former Ukraine. It was in the old Soviet Union, and it was the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Accord, the deal that was struck between Stalin and Hitler. And I was travelling into the Ukraine on a train. It was nearly midnight, and 3 of us were taken off that train at the border post with the between Poland and Ukraine, and we were kept there overnight. And it wasn't much of a loss of liberty, but during the course of the night they searched us and they emptied our bags. They took out 200 Ukrainian prayer books that I had in one of the bags and a camera for one of our TV stations in England. And I thought they were going to perhaps confiscate and take these things. They didn't in the end. They put them back. They did, however, confiscate a copy of a biography of the late Cardinal Basil Hume. I told him subsequently they clearly thought he was far too subversive for the Soviet Union. But eventually we got into Lvov, and we met there a bishop, Pavlo Vasilik, who'd spent 18 years of his life, this lovely Greek Catholic bishop, in full communion with the Church of Rome, the Uniate Church, the Greek Catholics of the Ukraine. He'd spent all those years, 18 years, in prison for his faith. And I had supper with him and a man called Ivan Gel. He was the chairman of the Committee for the Defence of the Church in the Ukraine. He'd spent 17 years of his life in prison. And a young priest came in who just spent 6 months at Chernobyl clearing radioactive waste as a punishment for being caught celebrating the liturgies in the open. He had no protective clothing. And these things that we take for granted, being able to celebrate Mass, being able to be present for the sacraments, they were paying a real price for their faith. And I went away from there remembering what Tertullian said about the blood of martyrs being the seed of the Church, and feeling deeply inspired about the things that we enjoy and which others really don't, still in this day and age, still do not have the right to enjoy.
All these expressions of people living their faith and then therefore their lives being put in compromise, because that brings us, I think, to the issue of conversion. I mean, being a Catholic requires a true conversion. You're a lifelong Catholic. We know lots of men that were born Catholic and then are off. Their faith means nothing to them. Why have you become such a strong Catholic?
Well, I'm a cradle Catholic, but I agree with you that I think that's more than about being part of a tribe. We have to come to a conversion in our hearts. Every single one of us has to come to that conversion, touched by the Holy Spirit. We have to, our baptism has to go beyond the physical act of being baptized into the Church. We have to accept that in our hearts. And I think that's down to each one of us, and no one can force anyone to do this. This is a great gift that we're given by God Himself, which is the gift of free will, and we're free to choose it or to reject it. Today people talk about it's my right to choose. It's a great slogan of our times. It's like a piece of clapped out rhetoric really for the last 20 years. Me, my, I at the heart of the equation. My rights, not my duties or responsibility. Choice, not the consequences. G.K. Chesterton, perhaps the greatest English convert of the 20th century, said that to admire mere choice is to refuse to choose. He said that in his book Orthodoxy in 1906. To admire mere choice is to refuse to choose. So the challenge for us is to choose between the darkness or the light. It's a choice about whether we choose Jesus, whether we choose God, or whether we choose the alternatives. Now that isn't to say that we won't stumble on our way. A Jewish rabbi said that, talking about the journey of faith, he said that the man who thinks he is finished. We never finish. We constantly grow. C.S. Lewis, in that lovely book, The Last Battle, part of the Narnian Chronicles, says as they enter the new Narnia after their death, now we go deeper, now we go higher. So I think our journey of faith is about going deeper and higher. My faith began with my Irish-speaking mother. She was from County Mayo, that great Irish priest, Father Peyton, who coined the phrase, the family that stays together, prays together, who said that a world at prayer is a world at peace. He had it right, and it's that kind of, that very deep Irish spirituality which certainly affected me as a child. My father had been a soldier in the Second World War with his 5 brothers. He'd been a desert rat in North Africa at the Battle of El Alamein. And his younger brother, Teddy, was in the RAF, the Royal Air Force, and was killed. And my father always had a problem. He'd been an Anglican by birth, and he always had a problem with God because of his brother's death. And I remember always arguing with him about this when I was in my teens, and saying to him that you can't blame God for things that people chose to do themselves. Our chief rabbi in England, Jonathan Sacks, puts it very well when he says, people say, where was God at Auschwitz? They should ask, where was man? Where was man? So that's a challenge to each of us, to use our free will for right or wrong, good or bad. We are free to do that. And so I don't think you can blame God. Now, my father, by the time of his death, just before his death, he was coming in and out of consciousness, and he said to me, he said, I've seen Teddy, and Teddy's all right. This is his younger brother, Edward, and I felt this is one of God's small blessings. Catholics used to talk a lot about a good death, and I felt my father had that, and I felt his whole life had been a coming home to God, because the faithfulness of my mother, but also his faithfulness in abiding by his marriage vow to allow her to practice her faith in the way that she wished. He encouraged that. His commitment that any children should be baptized, we were. And then the opportunity to practice our faith, to go to Catholic schools as I did. I think I owe that as much to my father as I do to my mother, and I honour him for that. And I was very fortunate. Sisters of Mercy educated me, but the Franciscans baptized me. I was born in the East End of London. You're called a Cockney in England if you're born there. And I went back a few years ago to the parish where I was baptized to give out prizes at the school. And they said, do you want to come in and see the Church of St. Anthony? So I did, and we went in, and they had the baptismal register which they'd got out, and I looked at it and I said, whatever happened to Father Andrew? And the old priest who was standing there showing me the baptismal register looked at me and said, that's me, he said. And it was a wonderful moment for me to meet the man who'd actually baptized me. Oh, wow. And he'd given 40 years of his life serving people there in the East End of London. And, you know, when the church is so attacked as an institution, as it often is, people forget about some of our wonderful priests and pastors and religious who give their entire lives in the service of God and the service of people as well. Anyway, I was then educated by the Sisters of Mercy, and one of those who taught me when I was 5, she's still alive, Sister Vincent, a great woman who had a great love of life and teaching, and communicated a love of God as well to those young children. And the Jesuits who subsequently educated me, they got it right when they said, you know, give me a child till he's 7, I'll give you a man for life. Catholic education can do that. It can play a major part. It can also, when it goes wrong, and when we don't communicate the truth, it can do more damage than good.
If we pick and choose what we catechize, leave out parts of the equation, we end up with something that doesn't add up. And that's what we see in so many people today. They
I call it cafeteria Christianity, you know, pick and mix, take the bits you want, and you can't. You have to, the gospel's the gospel's the gospel. And we've got to communicate that real love of Holy Scripture. I mean, when I went up to Liverpool as a student, I studied divinity and history, but in many ways it was quite a superficial experience. It was an evangelical Protestant clergyman whom I met subsequently, great sportsman who played rugby and cricket, and we're still friends to this day. And it was he who first sat down and said to me, I want to pray with you about some particular issues I was facing. And it was he who started to really introduce me to the Word of God as something that had to really affect me at the deepest levels of my being. And so, far from taking me away from my Catholic tradition, this enriched my tradition, and it helped me to focus in more on the truths of the Church's teachings. So I don't despise anyone from other traditions. Indeed, I feel deeply enriched by them. But I also believe that the whole revelation is offered to us inside the Catholic Church, and in the very depths of my being, I long again for that unity of life that Thomas More talked about.
You mentioned Thomas More. When one time I asked my father, who was not a practicing Christian, and I think towards the end of his life, as he became closer to faith in many, many ways, I think partially because EWTN in many ways, but because of his illness, emphysema, he was not able to get outside the house. But I asked him one time, he loved history, and I said, back in the 1500s, Dad, who would you have followed? If you'd been living in the 1500s, of all the leaders, who would you have followed? And he said, Thomas More. And I said, why Thomas More? Because he was a man of conscience.
That's right.
And this issue of conscience, the second C, you know, you're a lifelong Catholic, but struggling. I think to me as an American looking in England, it would seem like such a struggle to be a Catholic in England in areas of conscience particularly.
Yeah, Thomas More, of course, said, didn't he, that he was the king's good servant, but God's first. And that's the same issue for us today, that we can be the good servants of politics or of our jobs in the media or in the church or in any profession, whatever it may be, but we have to be God's good servant first. And so it's Thomas More's struggle, but it's there in all our own lives. We may not have to face it in quite the way he did, with paying the ultimate price, giving his own life for his beliefs. But ultimately we do have to face that issue in politics especially. Many of us climb the ladder and we look as though we're making it, you know, going up there to become the great party panjandarum and or whatever. And you're always tempted to think, if only I can get just one step more up the ladder, then I'll start to change things. But in my experience, the only thing that changes is you yourself. I mean, you get more and more sucked into the critical mass of politics rather than really witnessing for the things that you believe, and you tend to go silent sometimes and not speak out when you should do, because you think it's going to so compromise your possible advancement in politics if you do speak out. And political correctness has been part of this. PC, it's called in England, probably the same here. Political correctness means just going along with the tide, going along with what people are saying, however absurd you may think it is. And we need a different kind of PC, political courage, and that's what Thomas More stood for. He stood for the courage that was willing to say to the king, no, you can't just dispose of your wife. If you do this, it will break marriage. If you want to know why half of American marriages now break up in divorce and 43% of British marriages end in divorce, you can trace it back to Henry VIII, when the King of England said, it's all right of me to dispose of my spouse and even to start killing his spouses. It's all right for me to set up my own church, because even though he'd been described by the Pope previously as the defender of faith, the title that was given to him in recognition of his previous defense of Catholicism. But when you then break away and set up your own church because you can't get your own way, I'm afraid that doesn't presage very well for society and its health, because people then think they can behave in the same way.
Yeah, and I was thinking that decision that he made that had such ramifications in England and then as, around the world was really such a suppression of conscience, because especially it seems to me, now this might be our American caricature of England in our movies and books, but that whole Elizabethan time, that it seemed like such a time not only of a person had to suppress their conscience not only as a Catholic, but even as an Anglican, to be very, very careful on how you expressed yourself for the long period of time, that it seemed to me what in the end it made lots of topics like politics and religions and other things you just don't talk about if you want to be able to live one with another. Is that a correct understanding of England's history?
It is, because of course during penal times in England, Catholics had to really go below the surface, and it was a catechumenate church where in most of the country people compromised and for a quiet life they drifted away, but there were others, the recusants of course, who decided to hold firm to their faith, and they went underground. And it wasn't until the early 1830s, after the passage of the 1829 Emancipation Act in England, that Catholics were even permitted to stand for public or political office. It wasn't until the 1870s that universities like Oxford and Cambridge would even allow Catholics to enter them. So it was a long time coming, and even now there are amongst some Catholics a sort of ghetto mentality that it's better to keep our heads down rather than to engage in public and political life. But this is absurd, because in fact more people now attend Catholic churches in the British Isles on a Sunday than any other denomination, and in England, with the converts, if you like, with Newman's Spring in the 19th century, not just John Henry Newman, but also Cardinal Manning as well, becoming the great leaders of the Catholic Church, these very considerable Anglican clergymen. And now in the late 20th and early 21st century, the Catholic Spring becoming like Catholic Summer, with 500 Anglican clergy having, within the last decade, become Roman Catholics. We can see that there is a realignment of Christianity taking place in England, and that I think will enable us to speak more effectively into a world that has really pushed Christianity to one side.
Yeah, the second guest on the Journey Home program back 5.5 years ago was Father Graham Leonard.
Yes.
So we've had his witness here.
But now Graham Leonard, who was of course the Anglican Bishop of London and is now a Catholic priest, is is a lovely man. And I vividly remember in 1990 when the British Parliament was legislating on whether it was permissible to experiment on a human embryo. But while on one hand we had the Anglican Archbishop of York, Dr. John Habgood, speaking and voting in favour of experiments on the human embryo, we had, as he was, Bishop Graham Leonard, Bishop of London, speaking and voting against. Yeah. And I knew that this man was on his journey, but because it was untenable for him. It's very difficult for many Anglicans who are far better Christians than I will ever be. For them it's very difficult when they see people like the present Bishop of Oxford in England, Bishop Richard Harries, speaking out publicly in favour of so-called therapeutic cloning, the cloning of human embryos. And where here is the imago Dei, the image of God, where here is a belief in the sanctity of human life, where here is a reverence for human life from the womb to the tomb. And I think that this is an issue which is going to continue to draw more and more people into the Catholic Church, because the Church, from Humanae Vitae on to the publication of Evangelium Vitae, particularly through the extraordinary witness and encyclicals of His Holiness Pope John Paul II, has spoken so consistently at a time when it's been so unpopular to do so on the sanctity of human life. And I think as we as Christians think of our own narrative, we think of the story of Jesus himself and the world who despised him. We think of Jesus carrying his cross. This wasn't the sign of political success to be executed, to be hung on a cross over on Golgotha on the rubbish tip overlooking Jerusalem. It wasn't a sign of success that the mob in Jerusalem yelled for Barabbas and for his freedom, not for Jesus. And the mob will probably not be on our side on many of these questions, but truth is all that matters here. And I think that so long as we continue to witness for truth, despite our individual imperfections, and our imperfections as an institution, it's called sin, and that will always be with us. Despite that, if we can remain true to the gospel and remain true to the imago Dei, the image of God written in the heart and soul of every man, then I think that the world will eventually, in the fullness of time, in good season and in bad, I think the world will then turn again.
Yeah. We're going to take a break and then we'll come back and first talk about the third C, compromise, and then take some emails. But as I go, sadly, when you look at the state of the faith in England, it to me is a visual lesson for us of what happens when you unhook your tether from the magisterium, from the Holy Father. And it was when that was unhooked and the boat was free to drift, look at what's happened. I mean, it's a lesson we need to learn.
It is.
And it calls us, you know, and the other thing is, there's a great Latin phrase which we must never forget. It's mea culpa. Mea culpa, you know, my fault.
Mea maxima culpa.
Mea maxima culpa. But we're going to take a break. We'll be back just a moment with more with Lord David Alton. Welcome back. Our guest is Lord David Alton from England, and he's here at EWTN filming a series on his mission called the Jubilee. All right.
Jubilee campaign.
Jubilee campaign. And we were talking about conscience, kind of moving over into the struggle between conscience and compromise. When you're in a position of leadership, living your faith, as, let's say, Thomas More and others, they're called to a very difficult decision. You had some more thoughts on that as we're closing.
Well, one of the things that struck me, Marcus, when we were talking about More is that, of course, he tried to do everything he possibly could to reach an agreement with the king. He tried to find every possible way of dealing with his disagreement. But in the end, he realised that there was no way forward. And I think politics is like that. I mean, after all, Thomas More was the Speaker of the House of Commons, and he was the Lord Chancellor in the House of Lords. And having personally served in both of those places, an enormous privilege for me, I can see why the Holy Father has declared Thomas More to be the patron saint of politicians, and actually of lawyers, of course, as well, but of politicians and statesmen, because More did struggle with the world. He did struggle to try and find a way forward, but ultimately, when he knew that there was no way forward, he was prepared to lay down his life. And Jesus says that greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for his friends. And for More's friends, he knew that it would only be by laying down his life that he could point them at the truth. I've got some words of Thomas More, which were a lovely meditation, but I included in a book I wrote called Pilgrim Ways. And these give me a lot of encouragement. Perhaps they'll give some encouragement to some of the viewers as well. Thomas More said this: "If you love your health, if you desire to be secure from the snares of the devil, from the storms of this world, from the hands of your enemies, if you long to be acceptable to God, if you covet everlasting happiness, then let no day pass without at least once presenting yourself to God in prayer, not merely from your lips, but from the innermost recess of your heart. Give me the grace, good Lord, to set the world at naught, to set my mind fast upon Thee, and not hang upon the blast of men's mouths, to be content to be solitary, not to long for worldly company, but utterly to cast off the world and rid my mind of the business thereof." Now, I think these are wonderful sentiments for a politician, this idea of not listening to the blast of men's mouths. You know, we listen to the opinion polls, we lick our finger, stick it in the wind and say, which way is the wind blowing? You know, these are my principles, and if you don't like them, I'll change them. We just listen to what the blast of men's mouths have to say. And this point also about being able to cast off the world and to rid our minds of the business thereof. That sometimes, you know, a filled Filofax doesn't represent a fulfilled life. We can get to the point where we allow the world to suffocate us. And in the world of politics, we can turn our political parties into our church, and we can let them take over our lives. It can happen very easily. So I think More's life can give us great inspiration. Another person who gives me inspiration is Father Nicholas Postgate, St. Nicholas Postgate, who in 1678, while he was baptizing a child, this 82-year-old Catholic priest who was living a catechumenate existence in Yorkshire in the north of England, Father Postgate was arrested and he was taken away and he was executed. And he wrote these lovely words. He said, "O gracious God, O Saviour sweet, O Jesus, think of me, and suffer me to kiss thy feet, though late I come to thee. Behold, dear Lord, I come to thee with sorrow and with shame, for when thy bitter wounds I see, I know I caused the same. O sweetest Lord, lend me the wings of faith and perfect love, that I may fly from earthly things and mount to those above. And thus, dear Lord, I fly about in weak and weary case, and like the dove that Noah sent, I find no resting place. My wearied wings, sweet Jesus, mark, and when thou thinkest best, stretch forth thy hand out of the ark and take me to thy rest." Well, perhaps we need to remember as Catholics that the whole of our lives is a preparation for that death that Father Postgate talks about in those lovely words, that Catholic education is a preparation for dying. The only book that's going to matter to us when we're dead is the Bible. The Word of God is the thing that will have enriched us and touched us. Through the sacraments we'll have been made right with God. And as Father Postgate says in those words, that many were the times when you drift away, and certainly in my own life I've felt that drift to and from, sort of ebb and flow, and sometimes feeling that I've become more distant from my faith and not leaving enough space for prayer, not leaving enough time for spiritual renewal, and often failing as well. Some people say to me, "What kind of Christian are you?" I say, "Failed again Christian," because often that's how it is. You stumble and you fall. But the important thing is not to lose sight of the goal, and not to lose sight of the Lord who's waiting for you at the end of it. And you know, the man or woman who never made a mistake, never made anything, is not a reason for giving up on your faith merely because you fail. Everyone has been there, even the great saints. Look at St. Augustine.
Well, as a politician, you're in that position where you've got the external voices and every different opinion taking me. That you can't win for losing when you want to pull in a different area. Someone's going to criticize the decision you've taken on something, but you also have that inner spiritual battle, those voices from the left and the right that want to pull you. And we have this issue of conscience, taking a stand on your conscience, but how am I going to get something accomplished unless there are some areas of compromise? What about this issue of compromise? How do we determine the good compromise from the bad?
Well, we've been talking a lot about Thomas More, but I guess if I personally could choose another saint who I would want to guide me in this area of when it's right to compromise, the saint I would always choose is Saint Maximilian Kolbe. I think every politician should read the life of Maximilian Kolbe and understand what it was that Kolbe was prepared to do. Most of us collaborate, most of us conform. We go along with the tide of things because it leads to an easy life. Father Kolbe was offered the chance by the Nazis when they arrived in Warsaw to either cease the publication of his periodical called Night or to just comment on religiosity, to comment on pietistic things, but to make no social comment. And he responded the following day in an editorial which still rings down over the years. He wrote an editorial that said this: "No one in the world can change truth. What we can and should do is to seek truth and serve it when we've found it. The real conflict," he said, "is within. Beyond armies of occupation and the hecatombs of the extermination camps lie two irreconcilable enemies in the depths of every soul." And he said, "Of what use are the victories on the battlefield if we're defeated in our innermost personal selves?" Now, for writing those words, Father Kolbe was taken to Auschwitz, and of course he stepped forward and took the place of one of the Jewish prisoners who was lined up to be executed, and he paid the ultimate price in the same way that More had done for his faith. Father Kolbe, in that act of love, that paramount act of love, helps for me to redeem the hatred of that time, but it also points me at where we should be today, and that's being prepared to stand in the unpopular place, being prepared to be, as the Pope puts it, signs of contradiction. Of what use are the victories on the battlefield if we're defeated in our innermost personal selves? Of what use is it becoming a senator or a congressman or a member of the British Parliament if we're defeated in our innermost personal selves? Of what use is it to climb to the top of the tree in our careers if we're defeated in our innermost personal selves? So that's the point about compromise, that we must do all we can to stand alongside the world. We must do what we can to work with people, to be parts of coalitions with people, to advance the causes we believe in. But sometimes there will be a point where we know that this will conflict with the basic truth that we serve. And when that point is reached, we have to be prepared then to say no.
That kind of ties into the idea of the importance of having a good spiritual director, because sometimes we ourselves can be blind to our compromises. So we do need another voice that we can trust, who we know is faithful, can help us see.
But Marcus, one of the problems of the 60s, 70s period, I guess, was that a lot of people drifted away from the idea of confession, of confiding in a spiritual director, of talking to someone who would help them in their spiritual journey, in their quest to go forward. And I think that, again, one of the marks of this pontificate has been the call of the Pope that we should return to confession, and that we should show true humility in our lives, recognise that we make grievous mistakes, but then learn from the mistakes. Don't be hobbled by them, but learn from them in finding ways by which we can proceed and go forward.
Let's take we got an email here. Let's take, it comes from Lori Lieb in one of those branches of the British what's it called today? The Commonwealth,
we don't call
Ontario. This comes from Ontario.
Great.
All right. Marcus and David, I've noticed that it has become almost fashionable in certain circles to be a member of non-Christian religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, etc. Why do you think this is?
I think it may be because we've lost the plot. Sometimes we have become syncretistic. We've gone down to the lowest common denominator, and instead of witnessing to the truth, we try to talk the gobbledygook that the world talks. and then the world says, well, they don't believe in anything worth believing in. If it's not something you're prepared to die for, then it's not worth living for either. And if the church gives off an uncertain sound, if the church itself isn't able to speak clearly, then I can see why people will search elsewhere. But there's something else here as well, isn't there, that we do live in a time when people still have spiritual values, and actually opinion polls, for what they're worth, do tell us that a vast majority still believe in God. Though intriguingly, whilst 80% in Britain say they believe in God, only 20% say they believe in the devil. Now, I think that in itself is quite an interesting indicator that the comfort, if you like, of believing that there may be a God is not matched by the possibility that there may also be quite a force for evil around as well. And some of the New Age religions rather appeal to that streak in people, that they don't want to come to terms with the idea of a day of reckoning. They don't want to come to terms with the implications of the gospel itself. And so it's easier to go for something like New Age, which says that man himself will become a god.
I think you're touching, in my mind, a very important part that we've lost in the last 50, 60 years in our catechesis, is that there's an important balance in our catechesis, the way we're trained in our faith, between the fear of God and the love of God. The fear of God's the beginning of wisdom, Scripture teaches us. But we've gone so far, we've kind of wiped out fear, and we teach the love of God. Well, we end up, in the end, if we don't have that love, fear of God, that awe, we don't understand charity.
That's right.
And so we end up with people that think the most charitable thing to do is to allow abortion. And so they have a misunderstanding of charity. And so, as you're saying, they go for these religions that have this emphasis on charity without a fear. And we end up with a confusion. Let's grab another email, if we could. Robert in Elk Grove, Illinois. Dear Marcus and David, I would like to know why the Anglican Church does not want to see the need for the papacy, if even for the sake of mere logic, since how can anything stay cohesive without a ruler? Certainly Christ is the head. How can his church on earth be something other than in his resemblance, visible, not invisible?
My 11-year-old son, I think, has the answer to this question. He has a lot of answers to questions. But he asked me who appointed the Archbishop of Canterbury, because recently we had a new Archbishop appointed, and I tried to explain to him how this was the complicated election procedure and how ultimately the Prime Minister and the Queen made the appointment. And I then said to him, but of course the first appointment of an Archbishop of Canterbury was by Pope Gregory, and in the 6th century, Gregory, as a result of a conversation that he had in Trajan's market in Rome, saw some young Anglo-Saxons who were in the slave market, and he said, who are these young men? And they were fair-haired, they were very different from the people that he had seen in the market previously, in the slave market. And of course there's the lovely phrase that rings down the history books, oh, they're Angles, and he said, non-Angli sed angeli, they're not Angles, they're angels. And he then said to St. Augustine of Canterbury, not of Hippo, but Augustine of Canterbury, he said to Augustine, go to England and convert them, bring them to the faith. And so when Augustine then arrived in Kent at Ebbsfleet, he brought the faith to England. But who sent the man who became the first Archbishop of Canterbury? The Pope sent him. Now, we forget that part of our history. And without that link with the authority of Peter, then there can be no unity in the Church. And this is why, sadly, the Church of England has been so fundamentally divided, because ultimately there is no source of authority that can say, no, this is not the truth. No, we will not permit, for instance, abortion or embryo experimentation or whatever it may be, and why anyone can have their own opinion. And that in itself, I think, leads both divisiveness within the Church, but confusion in the world.
I hope this isn't insulting to our British listeners, my American ignorance here, but sometimes when I look at the image of English, it almost seems like sometime after the Reformation, somebody got the lists of virtues and vices mixed up. You know, where all of a sudden pride got lifted to the highest level of virtue. And I'm wondering, is that a caricature of English, the way they look at themselves, this pride of England, but yet where's the humility of their great gift of the faith they received?
Well, it's true. I mean, Aristotle first outlined the virtues, and then Thomas Aquinas tabulated them, and we as Catholics believe strongly in the concept of natural law, and we also know that within natural law, in the belief of the man made in the image of God, that there is no place for that kind of pride, that humility is what is needed. And it's not, as you say, a characteristic that's particularly associated with us as the English. I say to my children, you don't have to hate one country because you love another, and that's important for them and me because we carry both Irish passports and British passports. My father was British, my mother was Irish, and I think I look at the virtues of both the Irish and the English, and I think if you could take those virtues, and I also look at our vices as well, and if you could just take the best of both, then you really would have, I think, something pretty close to perfection. But the British do have great courage and fortitude, and those are the things that we mustn't lose sight of. And if that can be turned into something other than pride, then this again can serve the world. Take Edmund Campion, whom we talked about earlier on. His courage in the way that he stood before the interrogating committee in the Tower of London was so great, his courage was so great, that a young man who listened to him standing before the Anglican divines who were trying to catch him out, and this was after he'd been on the rack, this was after he'd been starved. His courage was so great that when Philip Howard heard him, Philip Howard converted. And of course, St. Philip Howard, as he became, died in the Tower of London. His families have produced all of the great Dukes of Norfolk who stayed true to the faith throughout and to this very day. Or you take the story of Henry Walpole, St. Henry Walpole, who stood at the very foot of the Tyburn tree where Edmund Campion was taken and executed, and some of the blood of Campion splattered from him onto the clothes of Walpole. Walpole converted as a consequence of what he saw of this bravery and courage of Campion, and as a consequence he then followed in Campion's footsteps, went to Rome, was ordained, and came back to the English missions where he was subsequently executed as well. So on the other side of the coin of pride there is this extraordinary courage and bravery. Campion, if I can quote him, said, "The expense is reckoned, the enterprise begun, it is of God, it cannot be withstood, thus the faith was planted, thus shall it be restored."
Maybe it's a good way to conclude is to talk about some words of encouragement from you to those who are watching who may blindly see their Catholicism as a tribal inheritance. Some words of encouragement to move a bit closer to God. What in the area of conversion from your own experience? Some words some practical words of encouragement to those watching.
Well, in the diocese where my family and I live in, it's called the Salford Diocese in the north of England. Our bishop asked me to serve on his Faith in the Future group, and I was very encouraged when I think about 30,000 people responded to a questionnaire that we did from within the diocese, and of those 90%, when asked what should be the priority of the church in this diocese, now in 2002 in England, they said evangelization. We need to re-evangelize. We have to evangelize ourselves. We have to ensure the faith is passed on within our families. We have to then make sure it's passed on within our communities. Each year I've been attending a conference called the Catholic Family Conference in England, which is held in Devon over Easter. 1,500 people come together, half of them under the age of 25. And this is the most wonderful event. If you have any doubts about the future of the church, just attend this. And last year, a couple of years ago, a woman came up to me at this conference and she said, "David, I've heckled you at meetings up and down the land on the abortion issue." She said, "My daughter came home 2 years ago and she told me she was going to have an abortion, and I remembered all those arguments. I used those arguments with her, and she said, that's my daughter, that's my granddaughter," and here they were, they'd come home, they were at a Catholic family conference. So I think we should be very encouraged.
You never know the seeds you're planting in all your relationships. David, thank Marcus, you. What a privilege to have you on.
I hope you enjoy your visit to England as well.
Yes, when the audience is watching this program, Marilyn and I will be in England. I'll be speaking at Westminster Cathedral for a conference there called Towards Advent, and also filming some Journey Home programs of English converts. So I hope the audience will enjoy those. Thank you very much. And thank you. God bless. See you again soon.